Okay, I think we'll get started now. Thank you very much to everybody who's attending today, and huge thanks to our speakers for joining today's webinar. My name's Kat Banyard, I'm Director of UK Feminista, and before we get started I'm going to give a few opening remarks to set the scene. But for those who don't know, UK Feminista is an organisation that supports individuals and organisations to take action for equality between women and men. And we're absolutely delighted to be joined by the speakers we have today, some of whom have been working for many years on the issue of pornography and trying to prevent pornographers being able to allow children to access their websites and their content. So very much looking forward to hearing what they have to say on the issue of where are the age verification controls in the UK that Parliament has already voted for. Now, in terms of, to provide some context, 3 years ago, legislation was passed in the UK which made it illegal for pornography websites to allow children to access their content. That legislation was called the Digital Economy Act, and part 3 of it specifically relates to making it illegal for pornography, commercial pornography websites to allow children to access them. Now, that legislation was passed, and I think it would be reasonable to assume then that it would, shortly after that, be commenced, it would come into force. It hasn't. The government has not set a start date, a commencement date for it, and in fact, just before last year's general election in the UK, the government suddenly announced, and I think it was a surprise to most people concerned, that it wouldn't be implementing these controls. It wouldn't be implementing compulsory age verification. Now, in terms of the Digital Economy Act. Now, this is despite the fact that this was legislation approved by Parliament, receiving cross-party backing. It was advocated for by leading children's organisations such as the NSPCC and Burrows, and 88% of parents in the UK with children aged 7 to 17 strongly backed robust age verification controls. Now, the reason that the government gave for not implementing this legislation was that they would pursue the objectives of the Digital Economy Act, or Part 3, in some upcoming legislation, which is referred to as the Online Harms Regulations or legislation. Now, I think in terms of the reason given, there was no pretense on the part of the government that it was because they thought it was never going to work or it couldn't be implemented. In fact, the BBFC, who were the appointed regulator, were expecting a very high level of compliance by websites. Now, the official reason given that actually the objectives of restricting children's access to online pornography could be reached through or realised better through the Online Harms Bill, well, that doesn't really stack up when you look at the detail that's been given so far of what that regulation will be, and we'll hear more about that later. Now, the legislation was in place, it was approved by Parliament, it had strong public backing, and yet it was put to the side. So what this seems very clearly to be is a decision by the leadership of the current government. Now, that's not to say that opposition didn't exist before the legislation was adopted. And the nature of that opposition, which did exist and which is still out there, I think is extremely instructive in terms of illustrating the power and entitlement that legislation such as this challenges. And also it's instructive of the strategies which are used to deter supporters and to dampen political support for it. And we need to learn from that, both in order to secure implementation here, but also so that other countries can move forward and secure the legislation in their countries, so that we can learn the right lessons from what's happened and avoid some of the pitfalls. But first of all, before I sort of say a little bit more about that opposition, it's worth actually going back to basics and thinking about what is it that this legislation is designed to restrict children's access to. So online pornography today, in terms of commercially produced pornography, what we're talking about, of course, is filmed prostitution, which is relentlessly violent in terms of contemporary pornography and misogynistic. For the non-commercially produced pornography, where supposedly the people haven't been paid to perform in it, of course, the user who logs on has absolutely no idea in what context that it was produced and what they're watching. They have absolutely no idea of the dynamics that were at play when it was filmed, how the individuals feel about it being online, if they even know about it being online. And I think as a current campaign around Pornhub aptly shows at the moment, sometimes in terms of the footage which is on these websites, there's absolutely no pretense that it's anything other than rape and sexual abuse. But pornography as a whole itself is a form of commercial sexual exploitation, as the Scottish government rightly recognises. And there are acute harms that relate to the production of pornography. However, we do not need consensus on that point, on the issues relating to the production of pornography, to recognise the very real harms which are experienced by those who watch it, particularly young people. And very clearly where this sits around that is as a child protection issue. And I think it's a really interesting example of where different interests and interest groups intersect. There are those who are concerned about all points in the process around production, but then there are those who come at it from the starting point is around child protection. And so that's where people convene, and why we had such great consensus around the need for restricting young people's access to pornography. Now, the change that was being requested, or that is represented in the Digital Economy Act, is relatively modest. In fact, it's extremely modest. We already have legislation in place which makes it illegal to give children access to pornography offline. So, for instance, in terms of hard copy pornography videos and video games, which are rated R18, these can only, not only is it illegal to supply these to children, they can only be supplied in licensed sex shops, and they're prohibited on linear TV altogether. But the absurd situation that we're in is that same content can be made, it's perfectly legal to make that same content available to children as long as you do it via a website. So what the Digital Economy Act would do was fill this very clear regulation gap. But then we looked to the opposition that was very much in evidence when campaigners moved to try and close that gap. So what does that opposition look like? Obviously, there'll be a whole range of starting points for people to oppose it, but I think there are two which were particularly strong and tell us an awful lot about the interests at stake here. The first was what is broadly put under the banner of so-called privacy. And it's just the one word which is bandied about, obviously, and conveys a sense of a very lofty and fundamental right. If we get real for a minute about what is actually meant by that, what that means is preserving the entitlement of some, mostly adult men in the main, to continue anonymously accessing filmed prostitution for their own sexual gratification. Okay, so I think there's a lot of really important job of actually just getting down to what we mean by this and whose interests are being defended. Now, actually, the campaigners and the bodies involved in this went to great lengths to ensure that anonymity and to lay to rest any concerns that particular interest groups may have around it. And actually, age verification technology would very strongly preserve what is referred to as privacy. But I think, and we may hear more about this from other speakers, that actually when those concerns were addressed, the goalpost kept shifting. So often when arguments are made, actually, if you dig a little deeper, there's something else going on, and it won't actually ever be satisfied. The other main line of opposition was around the notion that this legislation was pointless. Children will just use a VPN, which is a virtual private network, meaning that their IP address can't be detected, and that would enable them to bypass these regulations. And that has just making that argument has been extremely successful in deflecting support for this legislation, even from those who are ardent proponents of restricting children's access. Now, an important point here is that, well, websites can block VPN access. If children are found to be normally accessing pornographic websites using a VPN, well, then under the Digital Economy Act, they would be, it's the responsibility of the pornography website to prevent that. So a reasonable step they can take is to block VPN access to it. And there was a regulator in place who could have enforced this. But there was I think this is partly to do with technology and people perhaps having a low level of understanding around what is and isn't possible around regulating the internet, that may have explained how easy it was to deflect support using that argument. But also, I think how powerful the pornography industry is deemed to be, and how quickly sometimes as a society we cede power to that industry, that we quickly assume, oh, they're too powerful, we can't do anything. But actually here was legislation which clearly enabled quite robust enforcement. So where are we now? In the UK, the government is holding up the online harms regulation as the solution. We're all supposed to be reassured that something else is coming up and it will restrict children's access. I think there are major concerns and reason to be concerned around that actually their arguments don't stack up. Internationally, other countries are now looking to move forward and press ahead with implementing age restriction of pornography websites themselves. So today's conversation, I think, is extremely timely. It will enable us to reflect on what's happened so far, why this legislation is so important, what's happening internationally, what can be learned from the UK, and how we can all push forwards on this. Okay, so first of all, I'm extremely pleased to hand over to Andy Burrows. And Andy Burrows is the head of online safety, or child safety online at the NSPCC. So I'm just going to unmute you, Andy, now.
Thanks, Kat. Marked, it's now 3 years since the Digital Economy Act was put onto the statute book. Back to 2013, when David Cameron, the then Prime Minister, promised to take steps to make the internet safer for children, and signalled that age verification of pornography sites would be one of those measures. I want to just briefly set out why the NSPCC has been an enthusiastic voice for age verification to be implemented, what the evidence tells us about protection implications, just to reflect what I'm saying, how where we are, this is for really why we needed, why we can this on the statute book and age verification introduced, and I'll just briefly.
Andy, sorry to interrupt. The visuals, and it's quite difficult to hear you with your Wi-Fi. So can I suggest we move on to the next speaker, and if you are able to make any adjustments to see if we can try and improve the connection, that would be great. Is that okay?
Sure.
Okay. So John Carr, if we can move on to yourself instead. So John Carr, OBE, is chair of the UK Children's Charities Coalition on Internet Safety, which is a coalition of a range of leading children's organisations in the UK.
Okay, I'm just trying to bring up my presentation. Can you all see that?
I'm afraid we can't at the moment, John.
Okay. I can see it on my screen. Let me have a look. It's almost certainly at my end. Oh, there you go. By the way, I am a technology guru, just in case you're in any doubt about that. Can you, you've got a copy of it, Kat. Can you put it up?
I will try.
I don't know why that's happening. While we're waiting, I'll just pick up on the point about why the government did what they did on the 16th of October, particularly poignant as it was my wife's birthday. So if you remember last October, the only thing that the government was concerned with, its principal, in fact, sole preoccupation, was securing a general election. And since the reform of, there we are, that looks good. Can you move to the first slide then? I won't speak to all of this because there's too much, but you're welcome to have it as notes afterwards. But just to conclude the point I was making, the only thing that the government was concerned about last October was securing a general election. Now, in the olden days, the Prime Minister had an absolute discretion as to when a general election would be called. He or she would simply go and see the Queen, Parliament would be dissolved, and a general election would be held. Well, one of the products of the coalition government with the Lib Dems was that power was taken away from the Prime Minister, and we moved to a position where we have fixed-term parliaments. And fixed-term parliaments meant that the government no longer had control over when a general election would be. It would either take place at a specified and known in advance interval, or Parliament would have to agree, I think with a 2/3 majority, to grant an earlier one. And so everything that the government was doing at the time was designed to secure the agreement of Parliament as to that an election may proceed earlier than the appointed time. What that meant was that they didn't know exactly if or when they would get an election. And somebody, I suspect two people, Dominic Cummings and Munira Musa, who are key advisors to the Prime Minister, saw on the communications charts that on or about the 16th of October, an announcement was due to be made by the government, by Nicky Morgan, who was then the Secretary of State, in taking the final step that was required under Part 3 of the Digital Economy Act to bring the age verification laws into effect. That was the only step that needed to be taken. And I think, but nobody will ever be able to prove this until memoirs appear 30, 40 years from now, I think that their instinctive dislike of the legislation, because they are ultra-libertarians, combined with their political sense, told them that this was a risky thing to go ahead with right now, because there were two possibilities. One, the legislation would work, and that would mean at some point, perhaps even in the middle of the general election campaign, lots of young men wouldn't be able to get their nightly fix of porn. This would make them angry. They would want to blame somebody, and maybe in a handful of marginal seats, they would decide not to vote for the government because they deprived them of their fix, of their porn fix. And so that was one reason. for dropping it. The alternative was that the legislation wouldn't work, and then they would look silly, or maybe people who were strong supporters of it would become disaffected with the government, and they wouldn't vote for the government either in certain marginal seats, and that would jeopardize their grand project, which was getting a general election, winning it so they could proceed with Brexit. So that's my very low-rent political explanation for what happened. At no point did the government say, and this goes back to Kat's point, that they intended to abandon age verification. They came up with two reasons, principally to do with social media and privacy, that they said had not been adequately dealt with in the original legislation, and these would be expanded and included in a new set of rules when they came to dealing with the online harms white paper. Just to say quickly on that, we made the same points because when the bill came to Parliament, and in its immediate, well, certainly after it became law, a working group was set up within the DCMS, which was the lead ministry, and I was a member of that working group. And we said to the government at the time, you need to take care of the privacy stuff, and we would like social media to be included. And they said on social media, that's too big a project to take on in the context of this legislation. It's enough that we're doing it for commercial pornography sites. Social media sites are not principally concerned with publishing commercial pornography. It would broaden the scope of the bill. It's too ambitious. It would be bound to fail. We're not going to include it. And on the privacy thing, they wouldn't take that point seriously either. So what we ended up with, and this was a bit of a gift to the privacy lobby, we ended up with a voluntary code of practice on privacy. In other words, not a statutory one, not one with legal force. And that laid it open to, it was a gift, as I say, to the free speech lobby to exploit that apparent weakness. We wanted strong privacy legislation because we knew it was a political weakness. We wanted the social media companies to be involved. The government said no to both, and then subsequently, as I say, on the 16th of October, they gave those two reasons for abandoning the original plans to introduce the give final effect to Part 3 of the Act. The tragedy of it is, of course, we have no idea when the online harms paper will be translated into a bill, when it will come to Parliament. It could be 2-3 years or possibly even more before a new legal regime comes into force. In the meantime, millions of children will have been harmed and damaged by being exposed to pornography that needn't have been, because they could have gone ahead with the law as it was in Part 3. And if they were genuine about improving privacy or including social media at the time, they could have added that later. So I think the reason it was dropped was simply political, to do with their objectives in relation to securing a Brexit general election. So why did we not take on the wider arguments that Kat was referring to, which I think most of the people in our groups would probably agree with, but because we work as children's organisations, we had to stick to what we thought was our brief, which was to defend children's interests. If we had broadened the issue into saying all pornography is bad, all pornography is filmed prostitution, or made arguments of that kind, I'm afraid we would have lost. So that's why we decided strategically to stick to a very narrow set of arguments around child protection. Everybody understood what we were doing and why we were doing it. We never let any religious groups or any other groups of that kind become associated with that campaign. We worked entirely and largely, by the way, with a group of women parliamentarians to work on the bill and get it as far as we did. Lots of other countries were looking to Britain because we were the first in the world to pass any legislation of that kind. So it was a huge disappointment to lots of people around the world when the suspension was announced on the 16th of October last year. Nevertheless, and inspired partly by what we'd already done, the South Africans have passed similar regulations. They're in the business now of developing an implementation regime. The Polish Polish authorities, political parties and media regulators are very far advanced in developing a regime. In Australia and New Zealand, things have been moving at quite a pace. Canada is similarly looking at this. President Macron of France made some very encouraging statements. Even in the USA, which, by the way, I thought would be the last place on the planet Earth ever to address the question of otherwise legal or ostensibly legal pornography, even in the USA, there is a growing body of opinion in both houses of Congress to try and do something to keep porn away from the eyes of children. So there is a growing interest in this around the world. Up until now, people simply believed it couldn't be done. That the technology wasn't available or it was too difficult. We've proved now that that question has been solved. There is no doubt about it. We did it first with online gambling. Now we're going to do it with online pornography. I probably exceeded my 10 minutes. I can see Andy champing at the bit, ready to go. And he looks as if he's fixed his broadband issues. So I will stop there. I'm going to be here for the rest of the session. So if there are any questions, I'll happily deal with them.
Thank you very much, John. Okay, so if we now move back to Andy and see if the connection is working a bit better now.
With a router reset, hopefully that's made things better. Is that clearer?
Much.
Excellent. Okay, so I was saying, just to set out a bit of background really about the child protection implications and what we know about children's access to commercial pornography online and the implications of that. There's a couple of pieces of research that I'll speak to. The first is a piece that we did with the Children's Commissioner that was used to support the original passage of the bill, and then the refreshed data from the BBFC last year on children's access to pornography. Firstly, we know that most children and young people stumble across pornographic content. They're not necessarily seeking it out. Nearly half of 11 to 16-year-olds have seen pornography online, and they're as likely, in fact, slightly more likely to view it accidentally than they are to search for it. 62% of 11 to 13-year-olds say that they, the first time they came across pornographic material, they did so unintentionally, but that can also happen to children of a much younger age. So research has suggested children as young as 7 or 8 years old have stumbled across its content online. This, of course, is in the context, I don't need to tell anyone this, of increased smartphone and tablet usage. Over a third of 8 to 11-year-olds have their own phone. A greater percentage than that, around half now have a tablet. And just to give some sense really of how online is so ubiquitous to children's lives, we know that 45% of 8 to 11-year-olds that own a phone take it to bed with them. So really, you know, these are devices that are with them all throughout the day and all throughout the night. Now, precisely because children are stumbling across this material, we know that they're very often ill prepared for what they see. Many of the young people have told us that the first time they saw pornographic content online, they found it shocking and scary. Phrases like grossed out and confused were used to describe the experience. Many were particularly upset and disturbed by the aggressive and violent nature of many of the pornographic content that they'd seen. And some children reported to the BBFC study that they got lost in what were described as rabbit holes of pornography, where they saw increasingly more graphic content, and some young people spoke about the trauma of having seen that content. Now, we know that this negatively informs an understanding of sexual behaviour, of sex and relationships. Girls told the BBFC study that in particular they sometimes watched pornography to learn what to do during sex and to meet the perceived expectations of boys that are obviously then in turn shaped by the nature of this material, which is clearly disturbing. And there's the risk that it normalises aggressive and forceful sexual acts and really provides a distorted view to children and young people sex and relationships. A couple of stats that just underline that point. Of the 11 to 16 year olds that we surveyed, 44% of boys, 29% of girls said it gave them ideas about the types of sex that they wanted to try, and 41% of 11 to 17 year olds told the BBFC that watching pornography made them less respectful of the opposite sex. I think it's important as well to flag issues around consent. Some young people told us that pornography had affected their or their partner's understanding of consent, because consent is, well, best implied rather than clearly being openly discussed or spoken about on this type of content. So we're at the point where the Digital Economy Act was passed, but it hasn't been enacted. John spoke to some of the reasons why, but a few reflections, I think, and hopefully learnings for the future. Firstly, there was sustained criticism from the privacy lobby and for elsewhere that this was fundamentally flawed as a piece of legislation because it didn't speak to the VPN issues that Kat spoke about. We should be very clear that the purpose of this legislation was, in the first instance, just try and prevent children stumbling across this content. So there was a series of deliberate mischaracterizations about the bill, and as Kat spoke to, there are issues around how the legislation was framed, which addressed legitimate concerns, which addressed the critiques that were raised around being able to circumvent and see access through VPNs and the like. Secondly, there were very misleading concerns raised around user privacy and the suggestion that we could see some kind of Ashley Madison type hack of data of adults that were looking to access this content. And we should be very clear that the range of solutions that were put in place to age verify users were tasked with producing really a yes or no answer. Was the user over 18 or not? And that yes or no was the information that was being passed through then to the pornographic companies. So beyond that, concerns around privacy really were misplaced, but they were allowed, really unfortunately, to build something of a misleading narrative, to build a head of steam, which then became politically more difficult to take on. And I think there are some reflections there around how we can take this forward in future. I think probably the lack of more proactive comms to set out that this was on the statute book, that a regulator in place, that this was coming, that this was inevitable. In the absence of some of that, which wasn't as proactive as the NSPCC would have liked to see, it did open the door to mischaracterizations about this legislation, and from quarters in terms of public policy quarters, where I would hope that there would be a greater degree of understanding about where the legislation was and what the regulation would and wouldn't mean. So where do we go now? It's 3 years since the Digital Economy Act was put onto the statute book. It remains the quickest vehicle to secure age verification for pornography sites. If the government was minded to, clearly it could enact that legislation today and get underway. But as John spoke to, there were a series of calculations that were made in the run-up to the general election late last year, and government has signalled that it intends to progress this through the duty of care legislation. Now, I know that other speakers will speak in more detail about what potentially that would look like and some of the implications around that. I should say, as some of you will know, the NSPCC has led the campaign to get duty of care regulation on the statute book. It is an important and potentially transformative piece of legislation for regulating social networks and gaming sites. It wasn't envisaged as being something that would apply to the age verification of pornography sites, and a couple of considerations beyond the points around timing. It could be easily a couple of years, if not longer, before that piece of legislation is up and running. We have a regulator taking decisions. Firstly, it is a principles-based. We've advocated a principles-based approach to that regulation. So that means, we wouldn't necessarily see in that legislation an explicit there needs to be age verification, but rather a set of outcomes that would take you back to age verification. So we'd be looking at a different beast in terms of what that legislation looks like. And there's also issues around scope as well, around definitions and scope, and whether all pornography websites would fall under that bracket around user-generated content, which I know other speakers will pick up later. A couple of other options to try and arrive at the route where, if the government won't go ahead and enact the Digital Economy Act, we could get there by other means. One to flag, and at the risk of sounding horrendously technical, the Audiovisual Media Services Directive, which doesn't trip off the tongue, but that is an important dry run for the online harms legislation. This is a European directive that the UK government has said it will implement, and it has to be transposed into UK law later this year. Ofcom will be the regulator for that. And Article 28B of that directive requires video sharing platforms to take appropriate measures to restrict content that's negative to the physical, emotional and mental well-being of children. And there's the expectation that robust measures will be applied to those types of content that pose the greatest harm to children. Now, one of the restrictions around one of the downsides of that directive is that it applies on a country of origin principle. So it would only capture, in terms of UK regulation, those firms that have that are either based or have a substantive presence in the UK. With an eye to Brexit, if we leave without a transition deal, it is possible for that directive to be interpreted differently and to cover all firms that are that are based in the UK. So there is mileage to explore that as a route, as a dry run, effectively, before the duty of care legislation, the online harms legislation, materialises. Also, it's possible to interpret the age-appropriate design code from the Information Commissioner as a route, again, to try and get earlier headway in respect of age verification. Just a couple of final thoughts that I'd like to leave you with. One of the gaps, I know John was briefly talking about this, in the original legislation was around social networks. And so the requirement for a site to have at least 1/3 content that was considered pornographic before it fell under the scope of the Digital Economy Act. It fell into the scope, I should say. There is a prospect, given kind of what has unfortunately happened with the bill with the act not being enacted, to revisit that. And we know that there are real issues with children and young people being able to access pornographic content on social networks, Twitter, for example. And as we've seen a growth in user-generated sites, we know that social networks are being used by many of those accounts as promo material, effectively, to try and entice people onto the sites where then the money is made. And I would also just flag as well dating sites as being an area where we know that young people, unfortunately, it's all too easy for children and young people to be exposed to highly sexualized material, and that being another area where we would hope that age verification measures would be extended as part of the duty of care legislation. So those are some outline thoughts, and thanks for bearing with me through the need to do a router reset.
That's great. Thank you very much, Andy. Okay, so we're now going to be moving on to Meghan Donevan. Meghan is the Manager of Research and Prevention at Talita, which is a Swedish-based organisation that works to tackle commercial sexual exploitation and also to support those who are affected by it. So thank you very much for joining us, Meghan.
Perfect. Can you hear me?
Yes.
Great. Thanks, Kat and UK Feminista, for inviting me to speak at this important, timely mute now. Again? Great. So yes, as Kat just said, my name's Meghan Donevan, and I'm the Manager of Prevention and Research at Talita. We provide holistic support to women who have been exploited in prostitution, pornography, and human trafficking for sexual purposes. We also work through prevention and outreach. And I'm also an affiliated researcher at the Department of Global and Sexual Health at Karolinska Institute. So over the next 10 minutes, I'm going to briefly share about Talita's educational prevention resources. I'm going to highlight some of the research on children and pornography, and basically emphasizing why all measures aimed at limiting the pornography industry's devastating global impact are necessary. And just a little trigger warning, I will at times use quite graphic language, and the reason why I will use it is because I really believe that it's necessary to truly understand what sort of industry we're talking about today. So our prevention project is called Reality Check, and it's an initiative with the ultimate goal of preventing men's and boys' violence against women and girls and promoting young people's sexual health. So through research-based curriculum, including lessons plans, exercises, teachers' manuals, and digital solutions, as well as educational films, we basically give professionals and parents the tools that facilitate educating young people about the reality of pornography and its harms. And the tools are based on knowledge that's not only derived from research, international research, but also survivor accounts. And the knowledge covers the harms from porn culture, pornography consumption, and pornography production. Now, the approach we've used in our work, which we found very effective, is that we dispel common myths through facts and reality checks. So we've developed, for instance, an educational resource called 10 Myths About Porn, which has been translated into 7 different languages. And I'm sure Kat would be happy to share that resource with you following the webinar. So basically, what does the research say about pornography? Now, what are the common myths out there? So one is that most people, I think of Pornhub and Hustler, they think of magazines like Playboy and Hustler when they hear the word porn. But just as John Carr raised, one of the challenges we face today is that when it comes to addressing this issue is that many people don't actually have an idea of what the nature of pornography is today. So I think of the pornography industry as a myth-making machine. For instance, MindGeek, which is a company owning most of the worldwide production and distribution of pornography, including the largest website, Pornhub, they have obviously a huge incentive for us remaining kind of in the dark and not really understanding what today's pornography looks like. Why? Because we're talking about a multi-billion-dollar industry. So of course, those profiting off of this industry have a huge incentive to normalize their content, increase the demand, and expand into new territories. So for instance, reaching children. As Andy also addressed, while parents may buy into the myth, oh, well, my child doesn't watch pornography, it actually isn't really a question of if, but when your child will either intentionally or unintentionally come into contact with these images. Now, another popular myth is that, well, given the lack of sex education out there on a global scale, pornography could teach young people about sex. What would be required for someone to be considered effective sex education? Well, the World Health Organization makes it very clear. So they define sexual health as requiring sexual experiences free of coercion, discrimination, and violence. So now let me read a few popular titles to see whether the content and themes in pornography meet this requirement. And I think just so we're all on the same page of what children are being exposed to and what adults, primarily men, are masturbating to. So titles like Teen Girl Has Sex Sessions with Daddy, Anal and Ass to Mouth with Teen Slut, Teen Whore Fisted and Fucked by 3 Men, Toilet Mouth Rape, Getting Locked in the Bathroom and Forced to Suck Cock Before My Face is Flushed in the Toilet, Black Slave Punished by White Master. It's worth noting that this last title is a video on Pornhub, which claims to stand in solidarity against racism and social justice during now this Black Lives Matter movement. So I think here we really see this myth-making machine in action. We see pornography as the exact opposite of sexual health. It literally teaches and eroticizes men's violence against women, incest, child sexual abuse, and racism. And now based on social learning theory and different child development theories, it's no surprise that this content has very real implications for its viewers. So what are some of the consumption harms? People claim that there's not enough evidence that porn causes or is linked to violence. The people who say this have clearly not delved into the research. Hundreds of studies over the last 50 years have mapped out the link between pornography consumption and men and boys violence against women and girls. I encourage you to look at, for instance, Max Waltman's compilation of this 50 years of research. So taken together, the research is clear. Pornography is one of the factors contributing to men's and boys' violence against women and girls. Thus, when it comes to our global violence prevention efforts, they're going to remain in vain if we at the same time allow new generations to grow up with one of the clearest forms of men's violence against women in their handheld devices under the guise of sex and sexuality. And as Kat raised, I think in discussions about pornography, we often focus on consumption harms and perhaps buy into the myth that porn is just fantasy, it's not real. However, unlike movies with violence, we know that the violence in pornography is very real. It's no fantasy for the individuals that are filmed for its production. And Talita has supported women exploited in prostitution over the last 20 years. We've seen a very clear link between prostitution and pornography, which is partly why then we instigated our prevention work, but also why last year I conducted the first ever study on the pornography industry in Sweden. What we found and what we've seen is that women used in pornography production have the exact same backgrounds as those in prostitution and human trafficking. They're young, not infrequently children, underage when they come to the industry. They're almost always victims of child sexual abuse. Many have been drawn into it because of poverty and psychosocial problems. And of course, it's no coincidence that they're lured into the industry. Porn pimps are well aware that young women's vulnerability makes it easier to manipulate, control, and exploit them. Once in pornography, the violence and abuse continues. As I've read some of the titles, women are spit on, bound up, choked. They're penetrated simultaneously by 3 men. And what I would say is usually considered sexual violence, brutality, and demeaning behavior in what we call the real world is the norm in pornography. Now, in our work, we see that this violence and abuse has long-term detrimental effects. So the women we meet have PTSD symptoms that are equivalent to war veterans, state torture victims, and battered women. So regardless of what kind of prostitution the woman exposed to, they've suffered from a profound sense of shame, anxiety, depression. They can have suicidal ideation. And it takes years and years of holistic, comprehensive support to actually exit the industry. And what makes pornography such a potentially detrimental form of prostitution is that everything is documented. It's filmed. So when exiting the industry, women still face the fear of anyone stumbling upon these images. The research is also showing us that young girls' exposure to pornography is a risk factor for them being lured, groomed, and exploited in the industry and in prostitution. So by limiting children's exposure, we're reducing this risk, and at the same time, children won't inadvertently contribute to an industry literally built on violence, exploitation, and vulnerability. So I think it's really important to address both of these forms, consumption and production. And when it comes to how we address it, I think we need a variety of measures. It must be, we need to offer holistic trauma-informed support to women and girls. We need prevention through education, as we're doing in Reality Check. But we also then need our laws and policies to be either applied or otherwise updated to meet the challenges of our day. When it comes to our educational efforts, they're completely hampered by the fact that, when children are receiving education about pornography's harms in schools, they can literally simultaneously access pornography and these images in the classroom. And of course, we as educators have to think, how are we going to have age-appropriate discussions? And yet we know that children as young as toddlers can be exposed to these sexual abuse images, which is extremely traumatic and has long-lasting effects. So all in all, I'm trying to say that this age verification law is so, so important. Why anyone should be able to watch paid rape and online prostitution is also a question we ought to ask ourselves. But I implore those of you listening to understand and demand that an entire spectrum of combative and preventative measures, including age verification laws, are needed. We can't afford otherwise, and we can't afford to wait a second longer. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Meghan. Okay, so finally we're going to move on to Sarabjit Singh, who is a QC, a barrister at 1 Crown Office Row. So Sab, I'll just unmute you.
Thanks, Kat. So I'll be speaking to you today about legislation which affects the issue of access to online pornography by children. You've obviously already heard about the Digital Economy Act. That is the key piece of legislation. It's just important to note that that act is wide-ranging and it covers a number of issues relating to the digital economy. It's part 3 of the act, which concerns online pornography, and the key provision in part 3 is section 14(1), and that says that a person contravenes this subsection if the person makes pornographic material available on the internet to persons in the UK on a commercial basis, other than in a way that secures that at any given time the material is not normally accessible by persons under the age of 18. So what section 14(1) is intended to do is make it unlawful for anyone to operate a pornography website that can be accessed in the UK or otherwise make pornography available online in the UK on a commercial basis, unless some form of age verification procedure is adopted to ensure that the website or the material cannot normally be accessed by children. Now, what does making pornography available online on a commercial basis mean? Well, there are regulations that have been made under Section 14 called the Online Pornography Commercial Basis Regulations 2019, and they tell us. And what those regulations essentially provide is that pornography is made available on a commercial basis in a wide range of circumstances, such as where access to it is in exchange for payment, but also in certain cases where it's made available free of charge, but the person who makes it available expects some benefit in return. And section 14(1) will then apply. Now, Parliament intended that section 14(1) would be enforced by an age verification regulator who would have various powers set out in part 3 of the Digital Economy Act, which included imposing financial penalties and also, importantly, ordering internet service providers to block access to websites where section 14(1) had been contravened. Now, as Kat has pointed out, the Digital Economy Act has been passed by Parliament, but in order for section 14(1) of the Act to become law, it has to be commenced by a minister of the government. It is then said to be in force. Many provisions of the Digital Economy Act have been commenced by the government, but section 14(1) has not been, and neither has much of the rest of part 3 of the Act. So section 14(1) is not currently the law, and it won't be the law unless and until it is commenced by the government. What that means is that there is currently no legal obligation on those who make pornography available online in the UK on a commercial basis to ensure that the pornography cannot be accessed by children. And as far as child protection goes, that is a significant gap in the law. Now, why have the government refused to commence section 14(1) of part 3 of the Digital Economy Act? Well, what they have claimed is that the objective of part 3 would be achieved through proposed broader online harms legislation. And by online harms, they are referring to the harms covered in their online harms white paper dated April 2019. And that white paper covered multiple online harms, including terrorist content. One of the harms covered was children accessing pornography. Now, the government made a written statement on the 16th of October 2019, which John and Kat have both referred to, which stated that it had concluded that the objective of a coherent policy of protecting children from online harms would be best achieved through its wider online harms proposals, and therefore part 3 of the Digital Economy Act would not be commenced. What then are the government's wider online harms proposals? Well, when the government published its white paper on online harms, it invited consultation in respect of it. The government then responded to the consultation, and in its initial consultation response, which was updated on the 12th of February of this year, it said a number of things about the legislation it was proposing in respect of online harms. So these are the government's proposals. The government's proposals are probably best described as confused. And I say that for a number of reasons. On the one hand, the government said that it wanted to fulfill the aims of the Digital Economy Act, and indeed it wanted to go further than the Digital Economies Act focus on online pornography on commercial adult sites. However, on the other hand, the government said that the proposed legislation would only apply to companies that provided services or used functionality on their websites which facilitated the sharing of user-generated content or user interactions. What that means is that operators of commercial pornographic websites who do not provide such services or functionality will not be affected in any way by the proposed legislation. Moreover, the objective of Part 3 of the Digital Economy Act, as indicated by Section 14.1, is to prevent the making available of pornography on the internet to persons in the UK on a commercial basis unless in a manner that secures that it is not normally accessible by children. The government says that it wants to fulfill this aim, but it's difficult to see how the aim could be fulfilled without compulsory age verification tools. And yet the government has proposed that such tools may not be necessary. Now, we don't yet know what the precise scope of the actual online harms legislation will be because the legislation has not been drafted. But what you should take away from the government's proposals as to its scope is that it may very well not provide the protection offered by Section 14.1 of the Digital Economy Act. So certain commercial pornography websites that were covered by Section 14.1 may well not be covered by the proposed online harms legislation, and there may be nothing in the proposed legislation that obliges those who make pornography available online to stop children from accessing it. Now, how do you avoid that outcome? Well, it can be avoided by political lobbying, and that can be directed both at the government to persuade it to include age verification as part of the online harms legislation, and it can be directed at MPs more generally in order to persuade Parliament to amend any online harms bill that the government puts forward so as to ensure that age verification forms a part of it. Now, if that doesn't work, and if it becomes obvious that the objective of Section 14.1 will not be achieved through the online harms legislation, there is the possibility of a legal challenge to the government's failure to commence Section 14.1. And I think it was Angelica in the chat who raised this as a possibility. And as she pointed out, there is an existing challenge which has been brought by the Age Verification Providers Association, or AVPA. And now, I don't know the precise terms of that challenge, but I imagine that the driving force behind it is to protect the commercial interests of AVPA's members, because they've gone to the expense of establishing some age verification technologies and so on. So we'll have to wait and see what the outcome of that particular application for permission to apply for judicial review is. There is scope for a challenge brought by a broader coalition, so including child protection groups, in which it could be argued that the government had frustrated the will of Parliament by not commencing Section 14.1. I think someone on the chat Ian has said that the hearing on permission in the AVPA case is scheduled for a certain date. I can't read the date because I haven't opened the chat, but yeah, so that's an indication of the stage that challenge is at. But as for a challenge by a broader coalition which argues about the frustration of the will of Parliament and so on, it's important to note that there are legal precedents for such a challenge. That has happened in the past, and in fact it has succeeded in a case in the past. So it's just important to bear that in mind as an option if political lobbying fails. I think I'm out of my 10 minutes. So thank you very much. And it is indeed based on the Fire Brigades Union case, as Ian Corby has pointed out in the chat. Thanks.
Thanks very much, Sab. So now we are out of time. I perhaps might take this liberty just to spend a couple of minutes asking a question or two to the panelists. But for any other questions that we've received through the chat, so anyone watching this, you can type in a question which the panelists will see. We will take those away, and where possible, we can make information available on our website. But before I do that, I'm just going to make sure that all of our speakers are unmuted. I was keen to pick up on one point, John, which I think you raised in the chat, which was the coverage of the campaign to secure the Digital Economy Act, so to secure the requirement to age verify before going on a pornography website. You raised the issue of how it was covered by journalists. What was your experience of that? Was the press as a whole hostile? Did it vary? What was your experience of it? Okay, we'll come back to that. We've lost John. Meghan, I wanted to pick up on something, and I realise this relates to the production harms. But I'm very grateful to you for raising that, because as we've discussed, when securing a particular piece of legislation, there are political decisions to be made about what arguments are and aren't relevant or necessary, but an important part of the conversation and action for people concerned about production and what's referred to as consumption is the experience of women who are involved in making it. Now, at the moment, women who perform in pornography have absolutely no legal right to have footage of them having sex, performing sex acts removed from websites. Even where those websites are commercial, they are making money from it. Do you think that there should be a law which means that a woman who, or any person who's performed sex acts or sex on and that footage is online and being made available on a commercial basis, that she should have the right to have it taken down at any point? I realise that I sort of feel like we're at an early stage of discussing how to tackle production harms, but what do you think of that, and what other action do you think needs to be taken to protect women who are exploited in pornography?
Yeah, again, I mentioned Max Waldman, and I'd say he's one of the experts on this. And here in Sweden, we have discussions about the fact that, for instance, we have our prostitution laws, which serve to protect the vulnerable women that are in prostitution. And there we say that pimping is illegal, as well as buying sex, whereas selling sex is legal to, again, protect the women. And we're looking into or pushing for the ability for the government to actually then or I guess judges and law enforcement officers to actually implement those laws when it comes to pornography production, because we know that, as we said, the recruitment tactics, the exploitation, the consequences for the women, they're the exact same as in prostitution, and if not worse, because of this documentation. So porn pimps should be held accountable. And Max Waldman even talks about women being able to sue pornography producers or consumers who have been kind of inspired by pornography and then subject them to different violent acts, to be able to sue and and to basically gain damage for those damages done. So that's an idea, but it's really, we need a variety of different tools, as I said, and hopefully Sweden moves toward then being able to implement these pimping laws. I mean, we know that most of these forums like Pornhub, I mean, there's more and more cases where they're talking about there's cases of human trafficking, child sexual abuse, etc. So I think it's only a matter of time, hopefully, where we make measures to prevent these production harms. But actually right now I'm working with a woman named Melissa Farley, who's a world-renowned researcher, and we plan to investigate pornography production harms more comprehensively in Sweden, and hopefully those results will then lead to legislative changes.
Great, thank you, Meghan. Andy, I wonder if you could say a little bit about your impressions of how the campaign to secure age verification was covered in the press.
Yeah, it was frustrating, to be honest, because there were a series of characterizations from a range of interest groups representing privacy and other issues, which were given a free run. And a lot of the claims were often accepted as being valid and accurate without necessarily an exploration of those, because many of them were a misleading or creative slant, shall we say. And so on issues such as privacy, what AV solutions would do and what they wouldn't do, you know, a lot of those claims were accepted and given a media airing without being appropriately interrogated. And I think one of the key learnings for all of us who want to see action on this space is to make sure that there is a much firmer rebuttal on those claims, to try and ensure that journalists who are working in this space are, you know, kind of better briefed on this, because, you know, some of the privacy side stories, you could see why journalists were interested in them as strong stories, but, you know, kind of they could and should have been more strongly rebutted. And I think probably then, you know, there's a lesson here around the media coverage of this and how the political opposition to this built up, which is that then, you know, if government proceeds, it has to not only proceed, but it then absolutely has to own the policy proceeding towards implementation. And some of those media narratives could have been and should have been more strongly rebutted through a range of actors, but not least through government, who put this policy through Parliament in the first place.
Okay, thank you very much. And we are out of time, so I'm afraid we will have to draw the conversation to a close, but huge thanks to all of the speakers and everyone who's attended to listen to this conversation. Thank you for your questions. And as I say, we will take any extra questions away and try and provide you with any relevant information. And we will also send information on how you can stay in touch and how we can all move forward and make sure that this is implemented both here in the UK and to support those internationally who are working to prevent pornography websites profiting from children accessing pornography. Okay, thank you very much.